if I'm absolutely honest, I'm much more comfortable sitting at the piano and playing than standing here, but I will do my best. Nearly 100 years ago, in the early 1920s, the Russian pianist and pedagogue Leonid Nikolaev, who, as we all know, is the father of the St. Petersburg Piano School, philosophized on the subject of an omelette in the conversation with Shostakovich. One person cooks it, another eats, then comes a third person who knows neither how to cook an omelette, nor wishes to eat it. Instead, he likes to hold a discourse about the essence of an omelette, and the latter, in Nikolaev's opinion, was a musicologist. It's a bit brutal, but that's how it was. Galina Ustvolskaya, as we all know, didn't seem to have a high regard for musicologists herself. In her thoughts on creative process, she claimed that much of what is written and said about her music is untrue, and her music is simply misunderstood. Western fascination with Ustvolskaya that began in the late 1980s, thanks to Elma, led to creation of the Ustvolskaya myth, through which her music is very often perceived. I believe you're all familiar with the selection of quotations on the screen, which, in my view, summarizes the view on Ustvolskaya. The Russians also contributed to the mystification of Ustvolskaya image, and hence to the perception of her music. However, when a performer who encounters Ustvolskaya music for the first time reads the composer's own thoughts on the creative process, he is both intrigued and puzzled. Here, composer claims that her music is misunderstood, but she at the same time doesn't leave any keys for decoding it. Instead, we read that the music is new in both content and context, and therefore needs to be heard in a new way. That the music requires a non-standard musician to understand and appreciate it. That her music is spiritual, and the performer has to experience the suffering in the same way as the composer when she wrote it. And that the non-chamberedness of her music reflects the essence of the music itself. Having read that, we are left with this course, the simplicity of which is often disarming, despite the complexity of the musical context. The question many of us performers ask when we first encounter Ustvolskaya's course is not how to play it, but what to do with it and how to communicate it to the audience. From the very beginning of my PhD research, my main objective was to obtain a clearer understanding of Ustvolskaya musical phenomenon in order to inform my own performance of her works with authenticity and conviction, and give myself a sort of confidence to communicate the enormous complexity of her music and the circumstances in which it was created. As part of my research, I conducted a thorough analysis of Ustvolskaya's course. I familiarized with all the existing first-hand sources and printed publications going back to the 1940s. I conducted personal interviews with musicians who knew the composer and performed her work. And this vast amount of information gave me confidence not only to perform Ustvolskaya works, solo works, but to introduce her chamber composition, and the reason it was in inverted commas because she didn't believe that her music can be referred to as chamber. But here I'm talking about an ensemble compositions. To introduce it to my students as part of a chamber music project. The choice of repertoire for my final PhD recital, which was entitled Art with or Without the Influence, with a question mark, was determined by my desire to experience Ustvolskaya music in a variety of musical contexts. It was presented in the company of 3 other composers from St. Petersburg: Shostakovich, Alyosha Nikolaev, who was one of Ustvolskaya's most gifted students, and Alexander Kneifel, and 2 and 3 voices invention by Johann Sebastian Bach. Having based my choice purely on the characteristic of the musical text, the program illustrated that despite the unique nature of her language, Ustvolskaya was not an alien, but a part of the musical tradition. Collaborating with students of Chetham School of Music, the UK's largest specialist music school, for the ensemble part of my PhD recital, greatly enriched my experience. It was during the preparation for those recitals when I realized the unique practical value of this aspect of my research that combines performance and interpretation of Ustvolskaya ensemble composition with teaching the works to young, talented musicians. The preparation for those recitals and the recitals themselves gave me invaluable insight into Ustvolskaya music and provided me with inspiration and material for this presentation. So, as you've already guessed from the title of my presentation, I'm not going to be that third person who talks about an omelette. I am the one who eats it, so to say, and willing to share it with my students, because I'm the performer, I'm the one who deals with the music, with the musical text. As part of the project, we worked on 3 instrumental compositions of Galina Ustvolskaya: Trio for clarinet, violin and piano, 1949, Violin Sonata, 1952, and Grand Duet. Our performance as part of my PhD recital was preceded by a big Ustvolskaya event at Chetham School of Music and was followed by a similar event at the Salford University in Manchester. In my presentation that preceded our recitals, I aimed not only to draw the portrait of Ustvolskaya, the lady with the hammer, but to try and create an artistic portrayal of an extraordinary woman who lived and composed an extraordinary time in Russian history. Before choosing my partners for the trio, sonata and duet, I had to ask myself, what kind of musicians am I looking for to realize this project? Some of Ustvolskaya's comments about the performance of her work gave me some idea of what she herself was looking for in performance. For example, Ustvolskaya praised Anatoly Vedernikov for making the performance of her second sonata strong and convincing, and for creating a dignified interpretation of her work. Another comment concerned the pianist Alexei Lyubimov, who did not only possess the first-hand knowledge about her artistic intention in the piano concerto, but with him as a soloist, Ustvolskaya could be assured that her compositions would be interpreted correctly and performed again in the most dignified manner. In the letter to Patrick de Klerk, dated September 14, 1995, Ustvolskaya spoke about the high demands she has for the performance of her compositions and the importance of those demands being met. The fact that Ustvolskaya was very particular about the personality and professional characteristics of her performance shows that she was not only willing for her music to be performed, but it had to be executed in the way she intended. Speaking of the piano performance, during the late 1980s, Ustvolskaya suddenly changed her preference from St. Petersburg-born pianist Oleg Malov to Amsterdam-born pianist Reinbert de Leo. Ustvolskaya praised Malov on different occasions and recommended his participation in the performance of her works, and we do have a few evidence of that. In the letter dated 16 February 1987, she expressed her gratitude to him. Then again, 23rd February of the same year, and similar request was communicated in a letter to Mr. Goldstein on August 10th, 1987. However, it all changed in the early 1990s. A letter dated August 5th, 1992 reads, "If a new disc with my composition is to be released in the future, the performer has to be Reinbert de Leo and no one else." And another letter, Ustvolskaya yet again spoke about these two performances. This time particularly about the Grand Duet, which in her view, in performance by Oleg Malov and Alex Stolpner, was not satisfactory, and she would rather, from then on, it would be performed by Reinbert de Leo. In a letter from September 18, 1994, Ustvolskaya wrote, "I consider the recordings of Reinbert de Leo and Marianne Schroeder to be exemplary." Ustvolskaya's other comments that concerns performance of her music read, as I quoted earlier, "Only a non-standard musician will appreciate the novelty of my music. My music will find the performer who understands it correctly." After having read the composer's requirements, so to say, my questions were, would I be able to comprehend fully Ustvolskaya's artistic intention and execute her works in the manner she herself intended? And my second dilemma was, who will be my partners in the project? As for my second dilemma, I knew that I'm looking for 3 young musicians who are excellent players and who possess a full control of their instruments, intelligent and all-rounded musicians with an experience of performing 20th century music, and musicians who have inquisitive minds and who are passionate for learning. Luckily for me, the Chetham School of Music, where I currently work, was an ideal place for realizing such a project. My chosen musicians were Fiona Robertson, 18-year-old violinist from Glasgow, Joe Davis, 18-year-old, the cellist and the composer from London, and Jan Stephanie Im, the 15-year-old clarinetist from Manchester. At the end of the project, I asked them to fill in a questionnaire about the Ustvolskaya experience, and I will be using their comments in the course of this presentation. A learning process is undoubtedly very individual for every musician, and we performer know that apart from the very simplified steps where I listed here, the learning process contains other important ingredients, and above all, the search for what Heinrich Neuhaus called the artistic image of musical composition, that has been composer's artistic message that needed to be understood and communicated. So the question is, how to find the key for unlocking that artistic image of the composition? Some say intuition, other experience and knowledge. I personally share the view expressed by John Rink, who, while speaking of the performer's analysis, proposed the term informed intuition, which recognizes the importance of intuition in the interpretive process, but also the considerable knowledge and experience. I would like to start with Fiona and Violin Sonata, as it was the opening piece in our recital program. In her observation on the Ustvolskaya experience, Fiona said, I quote, "Having studied a little bit about Russian history of the 20th century, I knew the facts and dates about this horrendous period, but nothing had ever moved me like Ustvolskaya's music. It is clear, therefore, that music is the most emotive of the arts, and that Ustvolskaya was able to express the horrors of Soviet life more clearly than any photograph or textbook. I initially found the music hard to listen to, perhaps because I didn't have any knowledge of Ustvolskaya background, but one of the first things that struck me was the feeling of anger and oppression that came across in her music." At this, end of quote, at the start of learning the sonata, Fiona said, "My expectation of a relatively unknown composer were admittedly not extremely high before listening to Ustvolskaya music for the first time. Having known that she had been a pupil of Shostakovich, I anticipated hearing a style like his. I could not understand how this music could have been allowed under the Soviet regime, but once I discovered that these works had not been published until late in Ustvolskaya's life, it all made sense to me. After learning a little more about her life, I realized that there isn't really a genre for this music, and I began to value her music much more. Her music and her life began to fascinate me. Despite the fact that none of my students have learned the history of Russian music as part of the national curriculum at British schools, all 3 of them possessed a certain knowledge of 20th century repertoire through their performance experience. However, I wanted to give them a brief summary of the historical and cultural atmosphere in Russia at the time of composition, and to focus their attention on a few points that would highlight some unique characteristic of Ustvolskaya style. All the information to follow will, of course, be known to you, but for 18 years old, it was something very new. It was a new discovery. So, first of all, we discussed the outcome of the 1948 decree. I also presented Fiona with a brief survey of musical compositions written in Soviet Russia at the same time as the sonata, so between 1950 and 1952. It was very important for me to allow my student to make some kind of links and connections with familiar names and music from the period. So we looked at the scores and listened to some works by Shostakovich, Dmitry Kabalevsky, Sergei Prokofiev, Aram Khachaturian, Vissarion Shibalin. Among the young composers, among the composers of younger generation, we talked and listened to the works of Moisei Weinberg and Boris Tchaikovsky. As we all know that during this period between 1950 and 1952, Ustvolskaya herself wrote a few compositions on Soviet topics, which were later destroyed. However, these were the works for which Ustvolskaya was known to her contemporaries. After this background information, we proceeded to Sonata's background and its performance life. The fact that Sonata was the first work with which Ustvolskaya entered the Western musical arena was very significant, as well as the dates of the first performance and first publications. Having considered the background and the context, we turn to the most important source of information for a performer, the musical text. Using the three versions, in inverted versions of the sonata, and here I'm talking about the Soviet edition, published in 1966, copy of Galina Ustvolskaya manuscript of the sonata, and the edition published by Hans Sikorsky Musikverlag. After familiarizing with all these three editions, the number of issues had to be discussed, such as the score with sharps or flats, misprints in all editions or alternative notations, pros and cons of text with no bar lines, treatment of fermata, phrase structures, and main thematic elements and their meaning, structure of the piece, and the tempo plan. On the manuscript of the sonata, number 0476, kept at the Paul Zaka Foundation, there is a handwritten comment made by Ustvolskaya. It reads, tempo crotchet equal 112, flats has to be inharmonically changed to sharps. These are a list of sort of issues we had to deal with while comparing the three versions. So as a result of Ustvolskaya's request, the editions published in 1976 by Muzika in Leningrad is notated with sharps. However, the score, which we all know, published by Sikorsky, is notated originally how it was in Ustvolskaya's manuscript. For our first rehearsals, I brought all three different versions because I wanted Fiona to see the difference and for us to discuss the reasons why Ustvolskaya initially wanted to notate it with flats and why it was changed into sharps. The original notation with flat is undoubtedly more challenging to read than the version with sharps because of the large amount of double and triple flats. However, the artistic intention behind it is clear. It shows Ustvolskaya's predilection for the modes with flattened tones, which contribute to her distinct sound world. Of course, Ustvolskaya wanted her music to be performed, no doubts, but she never made it simple for performer. By encoding her musical text, she challenged the performer's intelligence, and above all, she challenged the true willingness to decode her text and understand the meaning. A few of Ustvolskaya's comments support my conclusion. I put my heart and soul into my music, and therefore my music must be heard in a different way. Listeners also have to work hard, end quote. And another one, I think that musicologists and performers must search deep and experience all the suffering that is contained in my works in the same way as I do. My music is very difficult both to understand and to perform. The comparison of three versions of which I mentioned earlier highlighted a few important differences which concerned articulation, dynamic indications, presence and absence of fermata, phrase marks or slurs, notation of long notes, numerical organization of rests and nods. And I presented my students with a detailed list of all those alternative notations, with the detailed bar numbers, and we've discussed all of those slight differences. In the end, we could conclude that the range of dynamic indication in Ustvolskaya manuscript and Sikorsky edition is much wider. Ustvolskaya was not afraid using 3 piano or 3 fortes. This is considerably smoothed down in Russian edition. Manuscript demonstrate very limited use of transitional dynamics indications such as crescendo and diminuendo that are in abundance in Russian edition. Familiarizing with these 3 versions in detail gives us a better understanding of the original text and the transformation it has undergone during publication. We all know that after second piano sonata written in 1949, violin sonata was yet another work notated without bar lines. For the convenience of ensemble playing, every 10 crotchets are marked by a rehearsal number. Such notation gives the music a speech-like feel and restricted by regular pulse. The shape, structure, and melodic direction of musical phrase is what organizes the composition and allows music to unfold in the most natural way. Ustvolskaya was not the first one who abandoned the bar lines. There are a few others. Just give you one example, I'm sure you all know that. In 1918, Stravinsky, whom Ustvolskaya admittedly admired greatly, in a second piece of his 3 pieces for solo clarinet, also notated music without bar lines. Among many other important aspects of the text, Ustvolskaya's use of fermatas, their length and meaning in the context of the work, was discussed in great detail. Ustvolskaya used fermatas on sort of very varied occasions in sonata, and we needed to find a way to interpret it. First, when it happened over a minim in phrases associated with a sigh, as in the example, we treated it as a moment of stillness and hence were more liberal with its length. However, when fermata sign is marked over a long period of time, for example, like in the middle part of the sonata, we try to maintain an equal duration of the notes. Ustvolskaya doesn't leave us any indication of how she wanted those fermatas to work, so we had to take a performance liberty here. The analysis of the phrase structure also occupied an important part of our rehearsals. The key element, the key melodic element of the sonata is a 5-note motive first introduced by violin in the opening. In general, the melodic material of the sonata is built of short melodic units, which could be called papievka, using Russian folklore tradition. The roots of such melodism, together with the regular meter and rhythm, can be traced back to the tradition of Russian folklore. The structure of Ustvolskaya melodies often resemble pятисложник, which is a poetic rhythmic structure based on 5-beat pulse that is very characteristic for Russian plach, which is a type of lament song. And it's also very typical of Russian phraseological structure. And here are a few examples. The examples of пятисложник can be found in the music of Glinka, Borodin, Mussorgsky, and Stravinsky, and it is in abundance in Ustvolskaya's scores. Next, we discuss the thematic elements and their meaning. As was earlier mentioned, musicologist Kiro Yezhak, who in 1979 published an article on Ustvolskaya, which in my view still remains one of the most detailed examinations of Ustvolskaya's style, recognized a number of genre prototypes in the opening of the sonata. She speaks of lamentation or plach, as it's known in the Russian tradition, which is in green in the right hand of the piano part. Another one is passacaglia, purple, left hand of the piano part. Znameny chant-like melody in yellow, middle voice in the piano part, and ritualistic declamation in the violin part, he is in blue. Fiona and I arrived at the conclusion that the piece contained three main ideas, symbols. The marching symbolized an oppressive road roll over the Soviet industrial machine. The malba, or prayer, represented by a falling minor third with a fermato on the last note, symbolized the idea of human suffering. And the chorale, a symbol of faith, a spiritual core of the work, that once again supports Ustvolskaya's statement that all her compositions contains a spiritual program. She says that in immense power and strive towards God lies at the core of each one of my composition, hence the term chamber music is not applicable to any of them, even as form of genre classification, end quote. Next we discussed interpretation, a very complex topic, but need to be discussed. The great Russian pianist and professor of piano, Genrikh Neuhaus, observed once that interpretation is often thought of as a way of adapting the piece to one's technical abilities. But here's a problem. Ustvolskaya's scores, including that of sonata, do not necessarily present many technical challenges in the traditional sense that needed to be adapted. The greater challenge is to prepare an informed and stylistically appropriate presentation that is both creative and true to the composer's intention. I wanted you to see how Fiona interpreted or understood the sonata. She said, I found the music structurally very simple and repetitive. However, the hardest challenge for me while learning it was to distance myself musically, as the music speaks for itself as long as you obey the instructions on the page. She continues, after performing the sonata for the first time, listeners, I became aware of the fact that the harsh sonorities and unusual phrase lengths did not distance the music in the same way as the complex serial pieces would. In fact, the music proved to be highly emotive and communicated various aspects of Soviet life, something which I find hard to grasp, having lived in the West all my life. This observation led to exploring the roles of performer in Ustvolskaya works. Is a performer an interpreter, or is a performer just a vehicle for conveying the composer's artistic intentions? As mentioned earlier, Ustvolskaya was very particular about the performance for her works, and whenever possible she coached them. Although she didn't openly express her view on the ritualistic role of music, including her own, her commentaries on the performer's dress, accessories, the place on stage, and the manner of behavior made it feel as if it's been staged in a manner close to a ritual. The performance of sonata presented us with a few challenges. The predominance of polyphonic texture required high degree of technical control. The absence of bar line caused a lot of ensemble playing challenging. The continuous intensity required a lot of concentration, and it was a rather emotionally draining experience for both the performance and the audiences. Since I think I'm about to run out of time, I will mention a few points about the trio and a few ideas expressed by the performer of the trio. Stephanie, the youngest out of three musicians, has never played any of Soviet or Russian music before, and she found it all very, very interesting. The trio is still notated with the time signature and bar lines. However, the meter is constantly shifting, which results in a change of time signature almost every bar. The contradiction between printed bar lines and orally perceived meter is transparent. Here is the beginning of the third movement of the sonata. And I highlighted every entry of the main theme in different color, and you can see that all of them have a slightly different metric structure. Another important thing about the trio, the new edition in 1975, which is very different from the Russian edition of the earlier, showed a few very important differences. The dynamic is very, very different and much more bold in the 1975 edition, and the structure of the coda, dynamic structure of the coda, is completely different. This is how it is in the Sikorsky edition, and in red, this is all which is new compared to Russian edition. And this is how it is in Russian edition. This is what Stephanie said about her perception of the trio. I quote, "I found the writing of the clarinet part very different to standard clarinet part writing. Many of the intervals were peculiar. Ustvolskaya wrote for the full compass of the instrument and used the full span of dynamic range. I had never played an ensemble piece with such an instrumental combination, but I highly enjoyed it. I found the piece quite simple to learn, although I found the ensemble work and counting loads harder. It was just a matter of placing your part in the right place, which took work. The complexity of the time signature threw me to begin with, and subdividing everything was what I found most helpful in learning process." There were other important aspects and difficulties of the trio. But another important aspect which we discussed is, what is this music about? It might seem very silly for all of us grown-ups, performers, musicologists with great experience. But for somebody young, you need to find the words to express the meaning and to find the similarity or connection between the experience expressed in the music and experience of ourselves, so we can create these kind of links. So these are the few sort of points that the children or students came up with. Very, very briefly about the last piece, Grand Duet. When I asked Joe, who is 18, to perform this piece, I was well aware that I'm putting lots of pressure on an 18 years old. But his observations were very, very wise and mature. I quote, "My first contact with the piece was through recording, and as per usual, when I sit down and listen to something, my initial reaction was motivated mainly by my interest in composition rather than my concerns as a performer. Before the end of the first movement, I remember thinking that the music seems to lack subtlety and humanity. The relentlessness of the material, marching on without development, in constant flood of crotches and quavers, called to mind a great grey machine. To be honest, I wondered how long it was going to continue like that. By the time the CD had come to the end, I had warmed to the piece slightly. The final movement created a truly chilling atmosphere, giving off the impression of frailty and terror in the face of distress and humanity of the preceding movements, memories of which haunted the finale right up until its conclusion. Following the similar patterns, we discussed the work background, we analyzed a variety of misprints, or shall I say alternative reading between 3 editions, the list of which was presented to my students, and we discussed it. This is what Ustvolskaya wrote in a letter, which demonstrated that she changed her attitude towards dynamics between the Russian edition and the Sikorsky edition. This example is something we had to deal with. The phrases without bar lines made it very difficult and challenging to establish the ensemble playing. So Ustvolskaya herself helped us by putting in the score a little vertical lines, as if demonstrating where the phrases are breaking, making it easier for us and more understandable to follow the thematic structure. There were few interesting points about partnership or rivalry in a duet, but I'm afraid I don't have much time about it. Just to summarize, I wanted you to hear what the audience feedback was and what the children said about the performance of the work. Joe said I found the incredible pessimism of the grand duet an obstacle to my appreciation. I believe this quality of the music must arise either from Ustvolskaya uncompromising insistence on truth or lack of substance. Looking at the evidence, I'm inclined to believe the former. Some of my colleagues at school asked me, why are you imposing this very complex, powerful but often negative music onto the children? And this is a very sort of right question which can be asked. But I felt that at the time when the quality of art is often measured by how well it sells, and as classical musicians we feel the need to learn how to be entertainers rather than artists, studying and performing Ustvolskaya music offered my students an immensely valuable experience. The reality out of which this music was born had probably very little in common with their everyday reality. However, Ustvolskaya music, with its raw emotions, so human in its core, forced them to connect and sympathize with another human being experience, and as a result, to appreciate how very fortunate they are. The last question in my questionnaire was, would you choose to perform Ustvolskaya piece in the future? The answer was unanimous, yes, and that was a clear indication of the job well done. Thank you.